In 1950, the White House still looked almost normal from the outside. Inside, it had nearly disappeared. Its floors were gone. Most of its interior walls were gone. Even the ground beneath the building had been excavated. The historic sandstone walls, the third floor, and the roof were held in place by a temporary forest of steel while construction crews and a bulldozer worked inside the empty structure. Engineers were not restoring a few damaged rooms. They were building a new steel and concrete building inside one of America's oldest national symbols. But this was not the first time the White House had been remade. The original residence was built by free and enslaved workers. British troops burned its roof and combustible interior. A rapid reconstruction introduced new timber into the surviving masonry. Later renovations added offices, steel beams, another floor, a heavier roof, and generations of mechanical systems. By 1948, floors sagged, plaster cracked, and chandeliers moved. To save the White House, engineers first had to take it apart. This is the hidden construction story of 5 structural lives inside the same famous walls. The White House was not demolished and rebuilt 5 separate times. For this investigation, its history can be divided into 5 structural lives, 5 versions that preserved part of the building while changing how it stood, carried weight, and functioned. The final version began inside the remains of the first 4. And the first began in a federal city that barely existed. Construction began in 1792, on a landscape of mud, woodland, rough roads, and scattered development. George Washington selected the site, but he would never live in the completed residence. The winning design came from James Hoban, an Irish-born architect who proposed a restrained neoclassical house for the President of the new republic. The design looked permanent. Building it was not simple. The new federal city had almost none of the supply chains, workshops, roads, or concentrated skilled workforce needed for a residence of this scale. Aquia sandstone was quarried in Virginia, shaped, moved toward the Potomac, transported by water, transferred again, and hauled to the site. The exterior walls combined substantial sandstone facing with brick masonry and internal construction behind it. Heavy timber joists formed the floors, while more timber framed the roof, stairs, partitions, and much of the interior. Every major piece had to be cut, lifted, aligned, and assembled with hand tools, timber scaffolding, ropes, pulleys, animal power, and human effort. The workforce was equally layered. European immigrant craftsmen, paid laborers, free African Americans, and enslaved people all contributed. Enslaved workers quarried and transported stone, made bricks, cut timber, and performed skilled and unskilled construction work. The building rose as a national symbol, but it also carried the labor system of the country that created it. John and Abigail Adams moved into the President's house in November 1800, while parts of the building were still unfinished. From the street, the stone exterior appeared permanent. But the floors, roof, stairs, partitions, finishes, and furniture behind it were combustible. The facade looked permanent. Almost everything behind it could burn. On August 24, 1814, British forces entered Washington during the War of 1812 and set fire to federal buildings, including the President's house. Flames moved through the combustible interior. Timber floors burned. Interior finishes ignited. The roof was consumed. Openings pulled heat and smoke through the building like chimneys. The fire destroyed the roof and much of the interior, but it did not erase the building's masonry outline. When the flames ended, portions of the sandstone walls and interior masonry remained standing. They were blackened, cracked, weakened, and exposed, but the shape of the house could still be recognized. The government now had a choice: abandon the damaged structure, demolish everything and start over, or evaluate the surviving fabric and reconstruct behind it. The decision was to rebuild. James Hoban returned to the building he had designed. Before new construction could begin, crews removed charred timber, collapsed debris, unstable masonry, and stone damaged beyond reuse. Without modern testing equipment, builders judged surviving material through visible cracking, deformation, soundness, experience, and direct inspection. Some stone remained, some was repaired, some was replaced. The fire destroyed the house people had lived and worked inside, but it did not destroy every wall that defined its form. One popular story claims the building became white only after the fire to hide burn marks. But the porous sandstone had already received a protective white coating before 1814 to reduce weathering and moisture damage. After the fire, renewed coatings unified old, repaired, and replacement surfaces. The more important transformation happened behind them. The original White House had taken about 8 years to construct. The rebuilt residence had to return to service much faster. Hoban reused portions of the surviving masonry, repaired damaged stone, restored exterior details, and reconstructed the interior. To accelerate the work, he substituted timber framing for brick in some interior partitions. That decision saved time. It also introduced more combustible and aging timber into the rebuilt house. New floors, stairs, partitions, and roof framing restored usable space behind the retained exterior. James Monroe moved into the residence in 1817, while some work continued. The rebuilding saved the White House. It also placed more timber inside a structure that future generations would keep loading, cutting, and rearranging. By 1817, the building already contained 2 construction histories inside the same walls. By the beginning of the 20th century, the presidency had expanded beyond what the original residence had been designed to support. The White House was still a family home, but staff, visitors, officials, and administrative work crowded rooms and corridors intended for domestic life. In 1902, Theodore Roosevelt authorized a major modernization led by McKim, Meade, and White. The project was not simply decorative. Victorian conservatories on the west side were removed. A new executive office building was constructed in their place, separating much of the president's work from the family residence. That early western office wing was modest compared with the west wing that developed later, and it did not yet contain the modern Oval Office. Inside the residence, rooms and circulation were reorganized for a 20th century presidency. The intervention solved an operational problem, but it also added new openings, beams, partitions, wiring, plumbing, and mechanical services to a building already composed of several construction eras. The White House gained room and function. Its structure became harder to understand. In 1927, the building changed again. Under President Calvin Coolidge, the old roof and attic were reconstructed to create a full 3rd floor. Steel beams helped support new guest and service rooms, additional working space, and a solarium. Functionally, the project made sense. The White House needed more usable space. Structurally, it added new weight and stiffness above an older mixture of masonry, timber, and earlier steel. The new floor did not immediately break the house. The problem was accumulation. A roof rebuilt in one era pressed onto walls altered in another. Steel members interacted with timber framing that had aged, been cut, or been repaired. Some interior brick walls carried significant loads without the foundations expected beneath major structural elements. Pipes, ducts, wiring, and heating systems crossed spaces never designed to receive them. Local repairs solved local symptoms, but sometimes redirected forces elsewhere. The White House still looked composed from outside. Inside, its systems increasingly disagreed with one another. A safe building needs a reliable path for weight. Roof and floor loads must travel through beams, walls, or columns, into foundations, and finally into the ground. By the 1940s, the White House contained load paths created in different centuries. Historic masonry carried some loads. Reconstruction-era timber carried others. Later steel beams crossed or replaced older systems. The 3rd floor and heavier roof increased vertical demand. Mechanical services cut through already weakened fabric. As the systems aged, they moved differently. Timber deflected. Masonry cracked. Steel remained comparatively stiff. Connections loosened. Moisture, vibration, repeated alterations, and time reduced the safety margin. The White House was not failing because one beam broke. It was failing because generations of construction no longer acted as one coherent structure. The warning signs became visible. Plaster cracked. Floors vibrated and sagged. Chandeliers moved. Doors and openings shifted. In the summer of 1948, one leg of Margaret Truman's piano sank through a weakened section of floor. The piano did not create the structural crisis. It revealed it. Engineers investigated hidden framing and concluded that local reinforcement could not restore confidence in the building as a complete system. The residents might continue standing for a time, but it could no longer be trusted as the occupied home and workplace of the president. Three options remained: continue patching individual failures, demolish the house and construct a replica, or preserve the historic exterior while replacing almost everything supporting and serving it. Engineers chose the most difficult option. They would preserve what the public recognized by rebuilding what the public could not see. The Truman family moved across Pennsylvania Avenue to Blair House. Inside the White House, furniture, fixtures, architectural elements, and materials selected for reuse were documented and removed. Before floors and interior walls could be demolished, engineers had to support the parts intended to survive. Temporary steel towers rose through the building. They held the retained third floor and roof, while demolition advanced below. Additional bracing restrained the historic stone walls against unwanted movement. The sequence mattered. Removing too much, too quickly, could change the balance of forces and allow walls to crack, lean, or separate. So the old interior came apart in controlled stages. Floors disappeared. Stairs and partitions vanished. Interior masonry was removed. Debris left through limited openings and temporary routes. Daylight passed through windows into a void extending from the excavation level toward the roof. From outside, the White House remained recognizable. Inside, it had become a construction site contained by historic masonry. At the bottom of that void, workers and machines appeared tiny beneath the supported upper structure. A bulldozer was needed inside, but engineers did not simply smash a large opening through the facade. The machine was dismantled, moved through the available access, and reassembled within the shell. The gutting was not demolition for its own sake. It was preparation for a new load-bearing system. Once the old floors and interior supports were gone, construction moved below the existing house. The retained walls and upper structure could not simply be placed on the new frame without suitable foundations beneath it. New foundation work was excavated more than 20 feet below the existing footings. This created space for two subbasement levels and the structural base of the rebuilt interior. The work took place inside the retained stone walls. As excavation deepened, engineers had to control soil movement and protect the stability of the fabric above. Temporary supports carried loads overhead. Excavation and foundation work progressed below. Reinforcement was assembled. Concrete was placed. New footings, basement walls, and structural bases formed a platform for the permanent steel frame. The new underground levels also created room for systems the old house had never accommodated efficiently. Air conditioning, electrical distribution, plumbing, elevators, service corridors, storage and mechanical equipment. The project was not only replacing failed beams, it was creating the hidden infrastructure of a modern institutional building. Before the new White House could rise, engineers had to build downward. From the concrete foundations, permanent steel columns began to rise. Beams connected them across the interior. Floor by floor, a modern structural skeleton formed inside the retained masonry. The project used roughly 660 tons of steel, but the significance was not simply the quantity. The new frame created an organized load path. The new frame did not turn the sandstone exterior into a modern curtain wall. The retained masonry still had its own weight, geometry, openings, and local behavior. Steel provided permanent support and restraint while carrying the reconstructed floors and modern building loads. The old and new systems had to meet without forcing brittle historic fabric to behave like newly fabricated steel. New floors could bear on permanent beams and columns. Modern services could pass through coordinated spaces. The retained historic fabric could be stabilized and connected to a system designed to carry the reconstructed building as a whole. For months, temporary towers supported critical portions of the upper structure. The permanent frame could not take over until its foundations, columns, beams, and connections were complete. Once that system was ready, the retained structure could be transferred from the temporary shoring to the permanent steel skeleton. Only then could the temporary towers be removed. Throughout the operation, engineers had to monitor movement in the retained walls, roof, and upper structure. The rebuilt White House now had something it had lacked for generations. Its floors, upper structure, historic masonry, and building services could operate within one planned system. A safe structure did not automatically recreate the White House people remembered. Inside the steel frame, crews still had to rebuild rooms, corridors, stairs, finishes, and proportions associated with the historic residence. That raised another preservation question. What does it mean to restore a room after much of its physical fabric has been removed? Some selected materials and architectural elements were reused. Old timber from cracked or removed beams was milled into decorative molding and paneling for parts of the rebuilt interior. But large portions of the rooms were newly manufactured. Reinforced floors replaced the old systems. Modern wiring, plumbing, elevators, ventilation, central air conditioning, and fire-resistant construction were integrated into the building. Walls and ceilings returned. Decorative plasterwork was recreated. Historic room geometry reappeared inside a structure that was fundamentally modern for its time. The result was neither a completely original 18th century house, nor a new replica disconnected from the past. The exterior masonry retained physical history. The location, form, function, room arrangement, and selected materials carried continuity. The steel and concrete interior made that continuity safe enough to occupy. The Truman family returned on March 27, 1952. From outside, the White House again looked familiar. Inside, nearly every major load followed a different path than before. So how much of the White House is truly original? There is no single answer. Some surviving masonry reaches back toward the earliest construction. Other stone was replaced after fire, repair, or weathering. The exterior contains material from multiple periods. The third floor and roof were retained during the Truman Reconstruction, but they had already been transformed in the 20th century. Many interior spaces reproduce historic forms inside a mid-century structural system. Later administrations continued modifying services, security, offices, and support areas. The White House is not a frozen artifact. It is a layered building. Its 5 structural lives show 5 different approaches to survival. Build with the available materials and labor. Reuse a damaged masonry shell after fire. Separate the family residence from expanding executive work. Build upward when space runs out. And finally, replace a fragmented interior with a coherent frame while keeping the symbol intact. The White House survived fire, expansion, structural failure, and the most radical internal reconstruction in its history. But survival did not mean preserving every board, brick, wall, or finish exactly as it had been. It meant deciding which parts carried the building's identity, and which parts had to change so that identity could remain standing. The walls kept the image, the new structure kept the walls, and inside them, a 5th White House began its life.